In their review of the 1986 animated film An American Tail, Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert contemplated on the dark and melancholy tone of the film, and whether or not it was suitable for its intended audience.
That's what little kids like when they go to the movies, sentimentality and pathos. They don't like to laugh, we know that. They don't like to be excited. This is the most downbeat children's movie since Return to Oz, which began, you may remember, with Dorothy being strapped down for electroshock therapy. What a wonderful, entertaining way for kids to go to the movies.
They were hardly the only critics to take umbrage with Tail's depressing atmosphere, but that didn't stop the movie from becoming a massive hit with audiences, especially kids. And, for a time, it was the highest-grossing animated movie in the United States, beaten out by The Little Mermaid 3 years later. From all the fond memories people have of this film, it's probably safe to say kids didn't mind a little sentimentality and pathos in their silly cartoon mice movie. Still, almost as in response to some of the backlash critics had against the tone of the original, the sequel, Fievel Goes West, features much less pathos and much more... To be fair, there is still some commentary on American life as it was back in the 1800s that is still relevant today.
They call America the land of opportunity. Opportunity for what? For children to play in the filthy streets? To never see the sunshine?
And the villain's plan of exploiting the mice for labor only to try and eat them when his project is complete can be applied to labor extortion practices that still go on today. But the focus is much less on commentary and more on... I'm not making a definitive statement on which American Tail movie is better. They both have their faults and merits. And I'd be lying if I said I didn't watch Fievel Goes West more as a kid due to its emphasis on comedy. Still, at least both films had much more commentary to offer than the direct-to-video sequels did. Yeah, you remember those? Back when Universal was trying to squeeze the life out of An American Tail the same way they did The Land Before Time? A lot of Don Bluth's work from the 80s saw the direct-to-video treatment in the 90s to pretty middling or downright terrible results. And while The Land Before Time was already on its 500th sequel, in 1998, An American Tail 3, The Treasure of Manhattan Island was shat out by Universal Home Video. So what, I haven't seen this movie since I was 6. What's it about? Some zany treasure hunt for pirate mice gold, or...
We're working ourselves to the bone while you're all getting fat. How about cutting us in? Actually, we're cutting you out!
Oh. I used to watch the third American Tail movie about as frequently as any other direct-to-video sequel we had in our home library. That is to say, I'd pop it on whenever I needed something to kill 80 minutes. And yeah, I liked it fine as a kid, but I don't remember giving it much thought as I grew up. At some point while most of the American Tail movies were on Netflix, I decided to give it another watch on a whim and was surprised to see how culturally relevant it was. I'm not sure when exactly I rewatched it, but it was somewhere between when I started taking the Black Lives Matter protests seriously and sometime after the inauguration of Donald Trump. A bit of a wide window, I know, but anywhere in that timeline is a revealing period for some of the themes present in this movie. An American Tail, The Treasure of Manhattan Island, henceforth referred to as An American Tail 3 for brevity, sees Fievel and his friend Tony discovering a tunnel filled with skeletons underneath the beach mnemonic transit system. In the paw of one of them is a map which Tony's professor friend deciphers to be made by the Lenape mice, detailing the location of their tribe's greatest treasure.
Treasure?
Treasure? Treasure!
Fievel, Tony, Tiger, the professor and his assistant Scuttlebutt all go down the tunnel system to find a hidden tribe of Native American mice, who fled persecution when the Lenape humans were forcibly evicted by the European settlers.
Our ancestors watched as the European humans came in their boats, bringing disease, gunpowder, cats.
I feel so ashamed.
The chief's daughter, Chelina, takes a liking to Fievel, and the two form an immediate friendship, to the point where Fievel offers to show her the surface world and see how much it's changed. Unfortunately, Scuttlebutt turns out to be a mole. Hey, wouldn't it be funny if they had made him an actual mole? Kind of a missed opportunity, if you ask me. For three robber barons who own the cheese factory that Fievel's dad and Tony work in, the three impose harsh and unfair conditions upon their workers, bribing the local police force to act as their enforcers. And upon hearing from Scuttlebutt that a native mouse is among them, they see it as an opportunity to turn the workers' ire away from them, and onto a new enemy. Thus they incite an angry mob to find and persecute Chelina, along with everyone else whom they call traitors to the American way.
Then let us go forth together. Let us find the infiltrator and send her back to her fellow barbarians with a message that this land is our land, and that we are going to keep it that way.
So, remind you of anything? It should go without saying, labor exploitation and xenophobia are hardly new concepts. They've been engraved in the American backbone ever since the beginning. New York in the late 1800s was especially prominent for the exploitation of immigrants for hard labor in sweatshops. This was briefly touched upon in the first movie, where Warren T. Ratt takes advantage of Fievel's naivete and sells him to a sweatshop owner. An American Tale 3, however, bases much of its conflict on the owners of the cheese factory, who are constantly scheming of ways to keep their power over the workforce, and have their pockets in other establishments around the city that might make them richer than they already are.
What Dithering doesn't know is, Scuttlebutt reports to us.
Just in case the good doctor digs up something we might like to keep for ourselves.
The effects of their working conditions are made prominent even before we meet them. The film opens as you'd probably expect, with a cheery musical number from the mice on how great it is to live in Manhattan and work for their own successes, living the American dream and all that. While when we first see Papa Mouskowitz, he's bone-tired and quick to anger at his family, lamenting on how different living in America is to how he imagined it.
Back in Russia, I taught music. Sometimes I made a few violins to sell. 2 jobs was enough. Aye, but here in America, here you need 3.
Again, this disillusionment with the supposed American dream was mentioned in Fievel Goes West. It's the reason they all moved out west in search of a new American dream. But in 3, the disillusionment is one of the main themes, if not the main theme. Fievel and Tony spend a lot of time in the beginning of the film talking about Tony's new job at the factory, and how the latter hopes he'll become rich in a matter of weeks because of it.
I only been working for a week. Getting rich takes at least a month.
But upon being late to work and nearly getting fired by the owners, Tony is denied a week's pay of money and cheese, and there's nothing he can do to debate it.
So much for getting rich.
When the bosses announce that they've acquired all the cheese manufacturing plants in the tri-state area, and expect the workers to triple their output in response, the few people who vocally speak out are suppressed by the police.
This is like Russia all over again.
It's a little disheartening to see Papa Mouskowitz, one of the most optimistic characters and believers of the American dream in the first film, become so downtrodden and exhausted in this one, barely scraping by and trying his best to keep his head down for the sake of his family. This is only made harder when Cholina gets involved and becomes the new scapegoat for the factory owners. The film's depiction of the native mice might draw some contention if it hasn't already. It's marginally better than how the natives were portrayed in Fievel Goes West.
How do you do?
And they did take care to explain how calling the various tribes across the continent Indians is entirely inaccurate.
The local inhabitants, what we incorrectly refer to as Indians.
Now, that doesn't really stop them from referring to the natives as anything but Indians from then on, but that was probably more for simplicity than anything else. Iffiness aside, the movie doesn't really hold back in describing the plight of the Native Americans as European immigrants started to settle near their land, and gradually begin to force them out altogether.
And we watched as the Europeans mistreated the Lenape, killed many, and scattered the rest.
It's almost unnerving how relevant this movie is to today's political landscape, and how long it took me to realize it. I mean, I'm not blaming 6-year-old me for not understanding the intricate natures of labor exploitations or racism, but at the same time, I feel like I could have been exposed to these themes much sooner had I actively engaged in them, rather than watch the movie because, cartoon mice. A little history about myself. I grew up in a middle-class American family where my mom worked as a teacher and my dad hopped around various places of employment before landing a job as a school bus driver. I was also raised religious and regularly attended church every Sunday, even volunteering at the kid and video departments. All of this is to say that I had a pretty average childhood. Not without its struggles, but marginally well off compared to others. Thus, I never really had to worry about politics and social issues. I was a cisgender white male growing up in a predominantly white family. Why would I have to worry about stuff like that? As such, I grew up believing what a lot of people who grow up in that setting do. That both the Democrats and Republicans are equally bad for the country, and the only true way to get by is to plant yourself firmly in the middle. At 18, I registered as Republican, but saw myself as independent. A word which here means a centrist, but way too up my own ass to realize it. As I went along my early adult life, I held on to this centrist viewpoint much longer than I should have. Ignoring the social issues at the time like Occupy Wall Street, the death of Trayvon Martin, and blaming any failure of the system on both parties because both sides bad. While I never veered too hard in the direction of the alt-right, my political compass was always in the slightest danger of falling there. Oh sure, I hated Nazis, the KKK, and all those other racists. But I wouldn't deny myself the good old-fashioned takedown of a feminist on YouTube if the mood struck me. It was around 2014 and after the death of Mike Brown that I started to look past my own experiences with the system. A system that I could claim was broken all I wanted, but wouldn't readily admit that it was broken in favor of people like me, white, cisgendered men. My political leanings would edge further left around the 2016 election, where I switched to Democrat to caucus for Bernie, and eventually cast my vote for Clinton. And then November 8th happened.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody. Sorry to keep you waiting. Complicated business. Complicated.
Like many who planted themselves in the center of the political spectrum, the progression of Trumpism in the United States pushed me all the way left. And I've only gotten more annoying to my conservative friends and relatives on Facebook since then. And I'm now further convinced that I could only have rewatched An American Tail 3 sometime after his inauguration because of how much I saw the modern day creeping into it. Trump based his campaign on a platform of blatant xenophobia and racism, with the promise of a wall between the US and Mexico to keep out all the rapists and job stealers that would invade us en masse if Hillary won. Not that Trump's victory really stopped them from fearing invasion.
Good gravy. A tribe of savages right under our feet? What if they invade us?
The tactics Trump used to rally his base, and continues to use even when his single term is near its end, are the same tactics the rich and powerful have used from the beginning to divert scrutiny away from themselves. To blame the latest boogeyman for the workers' trouble, rather than let them realize the truth.
We set ourselves up as the workers' champions and protectors.
And turn them against the Indians.
Of course, there'll be horrible losses among the workers.
But if we're clever about it, most of them will be the anarchists and miscreants in the crowd.
The police's role in An American Tail 3 is to enforce this status quo, to protect the interests of the 1% and maintain the system that works for them.
What are police?
They're these guys. They wear uniforms and they make sure everyone obeys the law.
Then they will help us.
No.
The police coming straight from the underground. A young got it bad 'cause I'm brown.
Granted, the main cop being Irish is a bit of a mixed message, considering Irish people weren't exactly considered Americans themselves at the time.
Yo, potato for brains, up here!
The fact that so many in the police are part of white supremacist groups, and just last week, Capitol building police were seen both letting in Trump rioters and taking selfies with them, is proof enough that law enforcement in America has been broken for much longer than people admit. But Trump and many other conservative pundits are able to twist the narrative to state that any criticism of the police is un-American, and that those who support Black Lives Matter or Antifa are the real enemies, tricking those who have never had to worry about their own relationship with the police into believing that everything is fine, that it's the protesters decrying police brutality who are the real problem, succeeding in keeping all criticism away from the system for as long as they can. An American Tail 3 represents a simplified realization of this fact, where after the mob tries to kill the professor for his involvement with the natives, Papa Mouskowitz is able to convince them of the error of their ways.
Don't you see? The enemy isn't Dr. Dietering or the Indians. It's them dividing us with hatred, ignorance, fear.
Don't listen to him! He's not one of us! He's a foreigner!
Mister, we are all foreigners.
Of course, this being a kids' movie, the reality of convincing a mob of the true problems in society is much harder, as 4 years of Trumpism has clearly shown. But even with this simplified take, at the end of the day, the movie doesn't pretend anything in the social hierarchy has really changed. The factory owners are still in power, and even with the workers forming a union, the owners are content to bide their time. The rich will still be rich, and the poor will have just a slightly higher chance of better working conditions. With Trump's presidency coming to an end, there will come an evaluation of his tenure as a whole, and re-evaluation from those who enabled him. And while I can't predict the future, when he leaves the White House, Trump will still have his cult, and he will still be rich through unscrupulous means. The system may not change overall, but with cooperation and empathy going forward, we can help push things in the right direction again. Or left direction, as it were. Does all this surprising relevance mean An American Tail 3 is actually a good movie? Well, no. The plot is, once again, very simplified, and everything that doesn't have to do with the social themes is your average direct-to-video affair. But that doesn't mean it has nothing of worth to offer either. My only wish, in hindsight, is that I took more of the themes it was trying to say to heart when I was younger, and I implore anyone with children to not simply put on some random movie or show for them to watch and allow the warm glow of television to babysit them for an hour and a half. Engage with them in some of the themes any given media is trying to represent. Let them know about how the system tends to favor certain groups of people over others. Let them know how certain stereotypes might be harmful even when they're trying to present something good. I made fun of Siskel and Ebert's review of the first movie before, and while I severely think they misjudge what children are interested in, they still bring up several valid criticisms regarding the first movie's treatment of its own Jewish characters. How the movie starts out with a Hanukkah celebration and a pogrom, but keeps the Moskowitz's Jewish heritage at arm's length for the rest of it. How there are several characters in the film that reinforce stereotypes in their own right. You may or may not agree with these assessments, but they're worth discussing nonetheless. Now more than ever, it's important to really analyze the media we partake in. As much as we should analyze the rhetoric and intent of our political leaders and those who seek higher office, especially when those politicians use the media to reinforce their own agendas, even when it doesn't seem like it. An American Tail 3 isn't a great movie. I hesitate to even call it a good one. But that doesn't take away the themes of labor exploitation and fear-mongering, with racist scapegoating that is just as prevalent today as it was in the 19th century. And if a direct-to-video sequel about silly cartoon mice made for a quick buck can express these themes, there's really no excuse to ignore them in other media. So, what's the fourth American Tail like?
What you doing here? Get out my house! Go away! Husband, come home. I serve him dinner. Eat real good. Then room shake. Floor split. Awful sound. Like million angry wasp. Aye!
Well, that's enough.